Welcome to Javel Stories. Before we continue with the story, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button, turn on the notification bell to always get notified for upcoming stories, and also share the story with loved ones and friends. Thank you very much. The estate of Warrington Manor gleamed in the soft golden light of an early summer morning. The sprawling grounds, adorned with vibrant blooms and centuries-old oaks, stood as a testament to the wealth and prestige of Lord Philip Warrington. From the outside, his life appeared the epitome of perfection. His marriage to Lady Eleanor, celebrated throughout the shire, seemed an unshakable bond of love and trust. But as the morning sun touched the stained glass windows of the manor, it also cast long shadows, hinting at the hidden complexities beneath. Philip Warrington was a man of integrity and quiet strength, admired by peers and tenants alike for his fairness. His steady demeanor and thoughtful gaze often masked the storms within. As he sat by the library window, absently swirling his morning tea, a heaviness pressed on his chest. It was not financial woes nor the affairs of the estate, but a gnawing suspicion that had begun to take root in his mind, a suspicion about Eleanor, his wife. Lady Eleanor was a vision of grace and charm. Her raven-black hair, always perfectly arranged, framed a face of delicate beauty. She carried herself with an air of refinement that turned heads wherever she went. To the outside world, she was the ideal wife, supportive, poised, and devoted. But Philip, ever observant, had noticed subtle changes in her demeanor, a restlessness that hinted at dissatisfaction. Their mornings, once filled with shared laughter, had grown quiet. Eleanor's interest in the household affairs seemed to wane, and she spoke more of social events and distant acquaintances. At first, Philip dismissed these changes as natural ebbs and flows in marriage. Yet, small incidents accumulated: her frequent absences, her sudden fondness for elaborate dresses despite his insistence on frugality, and her growing acquaintance with Gregory Standish, a merchant of dubious character. Gregory Standish was the kind of man who thrived on charm and opportunism. His wealth came not from inheritance but cunning deals and whispered promises. Though he carried himself as a gentleman, his reputation among those who knew him well was anything but noble. Philip had once seen Gregory speaking with Eleanor in the gardens, a conversation that lingered in his memory, more for the glint in Gregory's eyes than the words exchanged. As Philip finished his tea, he resolved to uncover the truth. He loved Eleanor deeply, but he could not ignore the unease that had taken hold of him. Love, he believed, was built on trust, and trust could not survive in the shadow of doubt. He would observe her, not as a husband blinded by affection, but as a man determined to protect his honor and legacy. With a deep sigh, Philip rose from his chair and stepped onto the terrace. The morning air was crisp, the gardens alive with the hum of bees and the chirping of birds. Yet for Philip, the beauty of the day was marred by the storm brewing in his heart. Unbeknownst to him, this day would mark the beginning of a test of love, loyalty, and the fragile nature of trust. Eleanor, meanwhile, moved about the morning with a practiced ease that betrayed nothing of the doubts lingering in her own mind. She had noticed Philip's growing pensiveness and the way his eyes lingered on her in moments of quiet. Though she wore the mask of a devoted wife, inside her ambitions churned. The comforts of the Warrington estate no longer felt sufficient. The glittering allure of wealth and freedom beckoned her like a siren's song, and Gregory Standish had promised her both. As Eleanor passed the terrace where Philip stood, she paused to meet his gaze. For a fleeting moment, she saw something in his eyes, an intensity, a quiet resolve that unnerved her. She smiled, the curve of her lips practiced and perfect, but the unease lingered. Philip returned the smile but said nothing, his thoughts already consumed with the test he was about to set in motion. This was the calm before the storm, though neither could have predicted just how devastating the tempest would be. Philip watched Eleanor as she moved away from the terrace, her figure retreating into the manor's halls. His chest tightened as he considered the weight of what he was about to undertake. To doubt one's own wife felt like a betrayal in itself, yet the signs were impossible to ignore. The very foundation of their union, trust, had begun to crack, and Philip was determined to uncover the truth. no matter how painful. He called for his trusted valet, Thomas, a man who had served the Warrington family for years with unwavering loyalty. Thomas entered the library, his posture straight and his expression calm, though his sharp eyes betrayed a keen awareness of his master's troubled mood. "You summon me, my lord?" Thomas asked, his voice steady. Philip gestured to a chair opposite him, but Thomas declined with a respectful bow. Philip leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished oak desk, and laced his fingers together. For a moment, he simply stared at the papers before him, organizing his thoughts. "Thomas, I need your discretion now more than ever," Philip began, his voice low. "What I am about to ask of you must remain between us." "You have my word, my lord," Thomas replied without hesitation. Philip nodded, taking a deep breath. I fear, Lady Eleanor may not be as loyal as I believed. There are whispers, subtle changes in her behavior that I cannot ignore. I need to know the truth, Thomas. I need you to watch her." Thomas's expression remained impassive, but his brow furrowed slightly. "Do you suspect her of wrongdoing, my lord?" "I hope I am mistaken," Philip admitted, his voice heavy with emotion. "But hope is not enough. Observe her closely, but do not make yourself known. If she is meeting with someone, if there are letters exchanged, I must know." Thomas inclined his head in understanding. "It will be done, my lord. You have my loyalty as always." Philip leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a brief moment. The enormity of his request weighed on him, but he could see no other way. Trust had to be earned, and if Eleanor had broken hers, the consequences would be dire. Meanwhile, Eleanor found herself in the drawing room, absently running her fingers over the fine porcelain tea set that adorned the table. Her thoughts drifted to Gregory's Standish. The merchant had a way of speaking that ignited something in her, a sense of possibility, of escape from the rigid expectations of a nobleman's wife. She told herself that her meetings with him were innocent, that she was merely indulging in conversation and flattery. Yet deep down, she knew it was more. A soft knock at the door startled her, and she turned to see her lady's maid and enter with a bundle of letters. "These just arrived for you, my lady," and said, setting the bundle on the small table. Eleanor sifted through the letters, her heart quickening as she recognized Gregory's handwriting on one of the envelopes. She hesitated, glancing toward the door to ensure no one lingered there, before breaking the seal. The letter was brief, but carried the weight of unspoken promises. "My dearest Eleanor, I trust this letter finds you well. Shall we meet tomorrow at the usual place? I have something of great importance to discuss, something that could change everything for you. Yours, Gregory." Her fingers trembled slightly as she folded the letter and tucked it into her gown. For a moment, guilt flickered across her face, but it was quickly replaced by determination. She told herself that she deserved more than this life, more than the quiet estate and a husband whose affection had grown cold, or so she believed. Little did she know, Philip's watchful eyes were already upon her, and the carefully constructed world she thought she controlled was about to unravel. Eleanor spent the rest of the day in a peculiar state of agitation. Gregory's letter lingered in her thoughts, each word echoing like a tantalizing promise. She kept it hidden, tucked close to her heart as though it were a secret treasure, and avoided Philip's gaze more than usual. Her husband had always been perceptive, and she did not want to give him any reason to suspect her. Yet she found herself questioning whether he even cared enough to notice her growing discontent. The following day, Eleanor dressed carefully, choosing a gown that was simple yet elegant enough to avoid arousing suspicion. Her lady's maid and helped her with the final touches, brushing her raven-black hair until it gleamed. Eleanor could feel Anne's eyes on her, curious but silent, as though the maid could sense the turmoil brewing beneath her calm exterior. "I shall be visiting the village today," Eleanor said, her tone light as she inspected her reflection in the gilded mirror. "I believe the tenants could use some provisions. Please inform Lord Philip that I will return by evening," and curtsied, her face neutral. "Of course, my lady." With that, Eleanor stepped out of the manor, her heart racing with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The morning air was crisp, and the gravel path crunched beneath her boots as she made her way to the carriage waiting at the edge of the estate. As she climbed in, she cast a quick glance over her shoulder, half expecting to see Philip watching her from a window. But the manor stood silent, its many windows reflecting nothing but the pale light of the rising sun. The ride to the village was uneventful, though Eleanor found herself glancing out of the carriage repeatedly, as if expecting to be followed. When she arrived at the bustling market square, she instructed the driver to wait for her while she pretended to browse the stalls. After a few minutes, she slipped away down a narrow alley, her footsteps quick and purposeful. Gregory was waiting for her at the edge of the woods, where the village path gave way to dense trees. He looked as suave as ever, his fine coat and polished boots at odds with the rustic surroundings. When he saw Eleanor approach, he smiled, his expression warm and inviting. "My lady," he said, bowing slightly, "you've come." "I've come because you asked," Eleanor replied, her voice firm though her heart raced. "You said there was something important." Gregory gestured toward a fallen log, and they sat, their faces shadowed by the canopy of leaves overhead. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small velvet pouch, placing it gently in her hand. When she opened it, her breath caught. A set of glittering jewels sparkled within, catching what little light filtered through the trees. "These are for you," Gregory said softly, "a token of my admiration, and a glimpse of the life you could have if you chose to leave all this behind." Eleanor's hands trembled as she held the pouch, the jewels feeling both thrilling and heavy in her grasp. She looked up at Gregory, her expression conflicted. "Leave? What do you mean?" Gregory leaned closer, his voice lowering to a conspiratorial whisper. "Your husband's estate is crumbling. The whispers in town are growing louder, Eleanor. Philip will not be able to maintain this life for much longer. But I can offer you stability, freedom, a life where you are cherished and not just another piece of property." Eleanor's mind raced. Part of her wanted to reject him outright, to hold fast to the life she had built with Philip. But another part, a darker, hungrier part, was tempted. The jewels in her hand glimmered like promises of a future she had long imagined but never dared pursue. "And what would I have to do?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Gregory smiled, sensing her resolve wavering. "Nothing difficult, my dear. Simply trust me, and when the time comes, you must choose whether to stand by a failing man or seize a brighter future." Eleanor said nothing, her eyes fixed on the jewels. She tucked the pouch into her gown and rose, her heart heavy with conflicting emotions. Gregory's words lingered in her ears as she made her way back to the carriage, unaware that from the shadows of the trees, a pair of watchful eyes had seen everything. Thomas, ever loyal, had followed her from the moment she left the estate. Hidden among the trees, he had witnessed her meeting with Gregory and her acceptance of the jewels. His heart ached for Lord Philip. But his resolve to uncover the full truth only deepened. Quietly, he slipped away, ensuring he would return to Warrington Manor long before Eleanor arrived. Thomas returned to Warrington Manor before the afternoon sun had begun its descent, his boots silent on the gravel as he approached the servants' entrance. Inside the familiar walls of the estate, the air felt heavy, as though the weight of the truth he carried had settled upon the very stones. Without delay, he made his way to the study where Lord Philip often spent his afternoons immersed in estate matters. Philip was seated at his desk, poring over ledgers with a furrowed brow. He looked up as Thomas entered, his eyes sharp and questioning. At a glance, he could tell his valet bore important news. "Well?" Philip asked, closing the ledger and leaning back in his chair. His tone was calm, but his hands betrayed a faint tremor as they clasped together. Thomas hesitated for a moment, knowing the gravity of what he was about to say. "My lord," he began carefully, "I followed Lady Eleanor as you requested. She met with Gregory Standish in the woods beyond the village." Philip's expression tightened, his jaw clenching as he braced himself for what was to come. "And—" Thomas's voice dropped slightly, as though the words themselves were too heavy to speak aloud. "She accepted a gift from him, a pouch of jewels. They spoke of leaving behind this life." He suggested she might find more stability with him should the estate falter. For a moment, silence filled the room. Philip stared at the grain of the polished wood desk, his breathing steady but strained. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost detached. Did she seem conflicted? Thomas nodded, though his expression was grim. She did, my lord, but she did not refuse him. She took the jewels willingly. Philip rose from his chair, moving to the window. The garden stretched out before him, vibrant and alive, a stark contrast to the turmoil within him. He placed a hand on the cold glass, his mind racing. He had suspected Eleanor's discontent, her growing distance, but to have it confirmed with such finality was a wound he hadn't prepared himself for. I needed to know the truth, he said, more to himself than to Thomas. And now I do. Thomas, ever loyal, remained silent, waiting for Philip to issue further instructions. After a long pause, Philip turned back to him, his expression unreadable. Thank you, Thomas. You've done well. For now, say nothing of this to anyone. Yes, my lord, Thomas replied, bowing slightly before leaving the room. When the door closed behind him, Philip sank back into his chair, his hands covering his face. The weight of betrayal was crushing, yet beneath the pain simmered a quiet resolve. Eleanor had chosen to entertain temptation, to take the first steps down a path that could not be undone. But Philip was not a man who acted on impulse. He would not confront her, not yet. There was still more to uncover, more to understand. By the time Eleanor returned later that evening, Philip had composed himself. She entered the dining room with her usual grace, her demeanor perfectly polished, though a faint shadow of guilt flickered in her eyes. Philip watched her closely as they shared a meal, his expression calm, but his mind calculating. You were in the village today? He asked casually, slicing a piece of roast. Yes, Eleanor replied, her tone light. I thought it wise to check on the tenants. They seemed well enough, though the market was rather crowded. Philip nodded, offering no indication of suspicion. It's good of you to take an interest. These are difficult times for everyone. Eleanor offered a faint smile, though she avoided his gaze. Of course, it's my duty. Philip said nothing further, allowing the conversation to drift into more mundane topics. All the while, he studied her, noting the subtle tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers toyed with the edge of her napkin. She was hiding something, and they both knew it. But for now, Philip would play his part, the dutiful husband feigning ignorance. Later that night, as Eleanor retired to her chambers, Philip remained in the study, staring into the fire. His mind churned with plans, each more complex than the last. He could not allow this betrayal to go unanswered, but neither could he act rashly. Eleanor's true nature had begun to reveal itself, and Philip was determined to see just how deep her selfishness ran. The test was far from over. The next morning broke crisp and clear, the pale sunlight filtering through the tall windows of Warrington Manor. Eleanor moved through her morning routine with practiced ease, greeting the servants with polite detachment and overseeing the household's daily operations. Yet beneath her composed exterior, her mind churned with Gregory's words and the weight of the velvet pouch hidden in the bottom drawer of her dressing table. She felt torn between her growing dissatisfaction with her current life and the faint, lingering guilt at having accepted Gregory's gift. Philip, as was his habit, spent the early hours walking through the estate. He greeted the tenants, checked the stables, and observed the laborers working the fields. His presence was a quiet reassurance to those who depended on his leadership. But even as he nodded to his steward or exchanged pleasantries with the village folk, his thoughts remained tethered to Eleanor and the betrayal he could no longer deny. By midday, Philip had made his decision. The time had come to set the next stage of his plan into motion. He returned to the manor and summoned Thomas to the study. My lord, Thomas said as he entered, bowing slightly. Philip gestured for him to sit. We must move forward, he said, his voice steady. I need to know the extent of Gregory Standish's influence over her. If he is offering her more than jewels, if there are promises of land, wealth, or a life beyond this estate, I must uncover every detail. Thomas nodded solemnly. Shall I continue observing her, my lord? Philip considered for a moment, then shook his head. No, that will not suffice. I want you to approach Gregory directly, under the guise of a neutral party, perhaps as someone dissatisfied with the estate's prospects. He is a cunning man, but he will not refuse the chance to expand his influence. Thomas hesitated, his loyalty warring with his distaste for deception. As you wish, my lord. I shall make contact with him at the earliest opportunity. Philip leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. And Thomas, he added, his tone softening, be careful. Standish is dangerous in his own way, and I will not have your safety compromised. Thomas inclined his head in acknowledgement before leaving the room, his mind already working through the intricacies of the task ahead. Meanwhile, Eleanor found herself restless. She wandered the gardens, her thoughts flitting between Gregory's bold promises and the life she currently led. She told herself she had every right to yearn for something more, that Philip's stoic nature had left a void in their marriage she had been forced to fill with dreams of independence. But even as she tried to justify her actions, a nagging unease refused to leave her. Her musings were interrupted by Anne, who approached with a letter in hand. "This just arrived for you, my lady," the maid said, offering the folded parchment. Eleanor took it, her heart leaping at the sight of Gregory's familiar handwriting. She dismissed, and with a quick nod, and unfolded the letter, her eyes scanning the lines hungrily. "Eleanor, the path forward grows clearer. Meet me again, and I will show you what awaits, a life free of constraints, one where you reign as you deserve. I await your answer. G.S." She clutched the letter tightly, her emotions swirling. Gregory's words filled her with equal parts excitement and dread. If she continued down this path, there would be no turning back. But the thought of remaining in Philip's shadow, tied to the unchanging routines of the estate, seemed equally unbearable. By the time evening arrived, Eleanor had resolved to meet Gregory again. She had convinced herself that it was not yet a betrayal, not truly, not unless she acted on his promises. But in her heart, she knew the line she was walking was dangerously thin. Philip, who had observed her closely throughout the day, saw the determination in her eyes and knew she had made her choice. He said nothing, merely bidding her good night with his usual quiet courtesy. But as Eleanor ascended the grand staircase, unaware of her husband's plans, Philip remained in the study, his expression grim. The trap was set, and soon Eleanor would reveal the full measure of her heart. Philip felt no joy in the coming confrontation, only the heavy certainty that his suspicions would be confirmed. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, casting flickering shadows on the walls, as Philip prepared himself for the battle ahead, not of swords, but of loyalties, choices, and the crumbling remnants of trust. The following morning, Eleanor rose early, her resolve firm. She dressed with care, choosing a gown of pale blue that she knew accentuated her figure without drawing unnecessary attention. The small velvet pouch of jewels remained hidden, a secret weight she carried as both a thrill and a burden. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through her bedroom window, she felt a strange sense of exhilaration. This meeting with Gregory would be different. This time, she would take control of her own future. By the time she descended the grand staircase, Philip was already seated in the dining room, sipping his morning tea. He greeted her with a warm smile, his calm demeanor betraying none of the turmoil he felt inside. Eleanor returned the smile, though it felt forced, and sat across from him as the servants began to lay out their breakfast. "You seem particularly radiant this morning," Philip remarked, his tone light but probing. Eleanor laughed softly, deflecting the comment. "Perhaps it's the fine weather. It's difficult to feel anything but content on such a day." Philip inclined his head, his sharp eyes watching her as she buttered a piece of toast. He said nothing further, allowing the silence to stretch between them. He knew better than to push her. Eleanor's true intentions would reveal themselves soon enough. After breakfast, Eleanor excused herself under the pretense of visiting the tenants once again. Philip did not object, merely bidding her a pleasant day. She felt a pang of guilt as she turned away, but she quickly dismissed it. Her life had grown stagnant, she reasoned, and Gregory offered her a chance to escape that monotony. Outside, Thomas waited in the shadows, watching Eleanor as she climbed into the carriage. He followed at a discreet distance, ensuring she would not notice his presence. The path she took was familiar, leading once more to the edge of the woods where Gregory often waited. Eleanor stepped down from the carriage, her heart racing as she made her way through the trees. Gregory stood beneath a tall oak, his polished boots crunching against the fallen leaves. When he saw her, his face lit up with a smile that made her feel both cherished and uneasy. "You came," he said, taking her hands in his. "I wasn't sure if you would. How could I not?" Eleanor replied, her voice trembling slightly. "You promised me answers, Gregory. I need to know what you truly intend." Gregory led her to a fallen log where they sat side by side. He pulled a folded parchment from his coat and handed it to her. Eleanor opened it carefully, her eyes scanning the bold lines of text. It was a deed to a property, a modest estate far from Warrington Manor. Her breath caught in her throat. "This could be yours," Gregory said softly. "A home of your own, far from the shadows of another man's legacy. But it will require trust, Eleanor. You must decide where your loyalty lies." Eleanor's hands trembled as she held the parchment. The promise of freedom, of a life unburdened by Philip's expectations, was intoxicating. Yet beneath her excitement lurked a deep sense of unease. Could she truly abandon everything she had built, everything she once valued, for a future built on Gregory's promises? Before she could respond, the sound of a branch snapping nearby made her startle. Gregory rose to his feet, scanning the trees with a wary expression. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice sharp. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the rustle of leaves. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest as she clutched the parchment tightly. For the first time, she felt the weight of her choices pressing down on her. Unbeknownst to her, Thomas had been watching from the shadows, his heart heavy as he witnessed the scene unfold. He slipped away, silently, determined to report everything to Philip. The truth was no longer a suspicion, it was a certainty. When Eleanor returned to Warrington Manor that evening, she found Philip waiting for her in the drawing room. His expression was unreadable, his gaze steady as he rose to greet her. She felt a flicker of unease as she met his eyes, but she pushed it aside, reminding herself that she was in control. "Good evening, my dear," Philip said, his tone calm, but with an edge that Eleanor couldn't quite place. "I trust your visit was productive?" "It was," Eleanor replied, forcing a smile. "The tenants are well, though I think we might need to send more provisions soon." Philip nodded thoughtfully. "I'm glad to hear it. The estate's welfare is always our priority." As he spoke, Eleanor felt the weight of the velvet pouch in her gown and the folded parchment hidden in her belongings. For the first time, she wondered if Philip saw through her facade. His gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than usual before he turned away, bidding her a quiet good night. As Eleanor ascended the staircase to her chambers, she couldn't shake the feeling that the walls of Warrington Manor were beginning to close in around her. Philip's silence was unnerving, his composure impenetrable. She told herself that her choices were justified, that Gregory's promises were worth the risk. But deep down, a part of her knew that her web of lies was growing fragile, and it was only a matter of time before it unraveled completely. The night was still, save for the faint creak of the wind against the windows of Warrington Manor. Eleanor sat at her dressing table, the dim glow of a candle casting flickering shadows across her face. In her hands, she held Gregory's parchment, the promise of a new life etched in bold ink. She read it over and over, her heart caught between anticipation and dread. The jewels lay beside her, their brilliance dulled in the candlelight. She looked at her reflection, searching her own eyes for answers. Could she truly leave this life? Could she walk away from Philip, from everything they had built together, for the chance at something different, something she was not even sure Gregory could deliver? As she folded the parchment and tucked it away, she heard a soft knock at the door. Her breath caught, her hand instinctively brushing over the drawer where she had hidden Gregory's gifts. "Come in," she called, her voice steady despite the thundering of her heart. The door opened to reveal and her ever-loyal maid. "My lady, do you require anything else before I retire for the evening?" Eleanor forced a smile. "No, Anne. That will be all. Thank you." and hesitated for a moment, her gaze flicking to the dressing table where the candlelight glinted off the jewels. "Good night, my lady," she said finally, closing the door behind her. Eleanor exhaled, her shoulders relaxing slightly. She reminded herself that Anne was loyal and discreet, unlikely to question what she might have seen. Still, the encounter left her unnerved. She knew the walls had ears, and Philip's quiet demeanor had begun to feel less like indifference and more like a deliberate silence. Meanwhile, Philip sat in his study, staring into the crackling fire. Thomas had recounted everything: Eleanor's meetings with Gregory, her acceptance of the jewels, and her interest in the parchment. The betrayal was undeniable now, no longer a shadowy suspicion, but a hard, unforgiving truth. He swirled a glass of brandy in his hand, the liquid catching the firelight. His heart ached, not just from the betrayal, but from the knowledge that this test, his carefully laid plan, was exposing something he had not wanted to believe about the woman he loved. Still, he was not yet ready to confront her. There was more to be learned, more of Eleanor's true character to be revealed. Tomorrow, he decided he would take the next step. The morning dawned gray and overcast, the sky heavy with a threat of rain. Philip found Eleanor in the breakfast room, seated by the window and gazing out at the gardens. She looked serene, as though the storm within her had settled for the time being. "Good morning, my dear," Philip said as he entered. He poured himself a cup of tea and took a seat across from her. "Good morning," Eleanor replied, her tone light. "It looks as though the weather will keep us indoors today." "Perhaps," Philip said, taking a sip of his tea. "But I was thinking it might be a good day for us to go through some estate matters together. There are decisions to be made about the tenants, the harvest, and the accounts." Eleanor hesitated, her smile faltering. Estate matters were not something she usually involved herself in, leaving such responsibilities to Philip, but his gaze was steady, his request leaving her little room to refuse. "Of course," she said finally, "I suppose it's only right that I take more of an interest." Philip inclined his head, hiding the flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. "Excellent. Let us begin after breakfast." The rest of the meal passed in relative silence, though Philip observed Eleanor closely, noting the subtle tension in her posture. She was not accustomed to scrutiny, and he intended to use that to his advantage. When they convened in the study later, Philip laid out ledgers and documents, explaining the intricacies of the estate's finances. He spoke with clarity and patience, though his true purpose was to gauge Eleanor's reaction. As he outlined the recent downturn in revenue and the challenges they faced, he saw the flicker of worry in her eyes. It was not concern for the estate, he realized, but fear for her own future. "Things have been difficult," Philip said, his tone deliberate. "But with careful management, I believe we can weather this storm. Of course, it may require some sacrifices." Eleanor's expression tightened. "Sacrifices?" Philip nodded, watching her carefully. "Cutting back on expenses, perhaps selling some of the finer pieces from the collection. It is only temporary, of course." Eleanor said nothing, her gaze shifting to the window. Her mind raced. Gregory's words returned to her. Philip's estate was failing, and she was watching it happen before her eyes. The life of comfort and prestige she had grown accustomed to was slipping away, and she felt powerless to stop it. Philip leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving her. "What do you think, my dear? Do you have any suggestions?" Eleanor forced a smile, though her voice wavered. "I trust your judgment, Philip. You've always managed the estate well." Her words were a hollow echo of the faith she once might have had in him. Philip heard it clearly, and his heart hardened. Eleanor was slipping further away, and she had no idea that he was watching her every move, waiting for the moment when her true loyalties would be laid bare. Eleanor's mind churned long after her conversation with Philip. His words about sacrifices and financial hardship lingered in her thoughts, feeding her growing fear. She had always depended on the stability of Warrington Manor, on Philip's ability to maintain their status and comfort. But now, cracks were appearing in the foundation of the life she had taken for granted. And Gregory's promise loomed larger than ever, a beacon of escape from what she increasingly saw as a sinking ship. As the day wore on, Philip continued to observe her. He made no mention of their earlier conversation, but ensured she was aware of his presence. They crossed paths often in the halls of the manor, his steady gaze meeting hers with a quiet intensity that unnerved her. Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that he knew more than he let on, though she couldn't fathom how. Philip was many things, reserved, meticulous, even distant, but he had never been the type to suspect her of anything untoward. By evening, Eleanor was restless. She retired to her chambers earlier than usual, under the guise of a headache, and spent the hours pacing. The velvet pouch of jewels and Gregory's deed weighed heavily on her conscience. She retrieved them from their hiding place and laid them out on the table, staring at them as though they might offer her answers. She could feel the walls of Warrington Manor closing in, the life she had known slipping through her fingers. The jewels sparkled in the candlelight, each glint a reminder of Gregory's promises, freedom, wealth, and a new beginning. But they also carried a darker weight, a sign of the betrayal she knew she was committing, even if she hadn't yet acted fully upon it. In another part of the manor, Philip sat in his study, his own thoughts a storm of conflicting emotions. Thomas had confirmed that Eleanor planned to meet Gregory again soon. The knowledge burned within him, yet he forced himself to remain patient. Confronting her now would reveal little, and he needed to see how far she was willing to go. He pulled out a blank sheet of paper and began writing a letter, one that would serve as a piece of his growing plan. It was addressed to Gregory Standish, written as though from an anonymous informant. The letter suggested that Philip had grown suspicious of Eleanor's activities and that her every move was being watched. It ended with a warning. Proceed with caution, for the shadows in Warrington Manor are long, and no secret remains hidden forever. Philip sealed the letter and handed it to Thomas with clear instructions. Have this delivered to Standish anonymously. Ensure it is placed where he will find it, but do not let yourself be seen. Thomas nodded, his loyalty unwavering. It will be done, my lord. As the night deepened, Philip sat by the fire, his thoughts heavy. He did not relish the game he was playing, but he saw no other way. Eleanor's actions had left him no choice but to test the depth of her loyalty and the strength of her character. If she continued down this path, she would leave him no choice but to take action. The next day, Eleanor awoke with renewed determination. Gregory's latest letter had instructed her to meet him at dusk, and she had already decided she would go. She told herself it was not a betrayal, not yet. She needed to understand his intentions fully before making any decisions. But deep down, she knew she was walking a dangerous line. She dressed carefully, choosing a simple gown that would not draw attention. As she made her way to the carriage, she informed the driver that she would be visiting the village again. Philip, who had been in the library, watched her leave from the window, his expression unreadable. He had already instructed Thomas to follow her once more, knowing that tonight's meeting could be pivotal. Eleanor arrived at the wooded meeting place with her heart racing. Gregory was already there, his confident smile lighting up his face as he greeted her. He took her hands in his touch warm and reassuring. "You came," he said softly. "I knew you would." "I need no more," Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite her nerves. "What exactly are you offering, Gregory? And what would you have me do in return?" Gregory's expression turned serious. "Eleanor, I am offering you freedom, a life where you are not bound by the constraints of this failing estate or the indifference of a husband who does not truly see you. But for this to work, you must trust me." He pulled a small key from his pocket and pressed it into her hand. "This unlocks a safe in my office. Inside, you will find papers that detail the arrangements I have made for us, a property, funds, everything we need to start anew. I need you to retrieve those papers and bring them to me tomorrow." Eleanor stared at the key, her mind racing. This was no longer a simple matter of flirtation or idle promises. Gregory was asking her to act, to cross a line from which there would be no return. Yet as she looked into his eyes, she felt the pull of his words, the allure of the life he described. I will consider it," she said finally, tucking the key into her gown. Gregory smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "That's all I ask." As Eleanor returned to the carriage, she felt a mixture of exhilaration and dread. She had not yet committed to Gregory's plan, but the path she was on felt increasingly inevitable. Unbeknownst to her, Thomas had witnessed the entire exchange, his presence hidden in the shadows. By the time Eleanor returned to Warrington Manor, the storm within her was mirrored by the gathering clouds overhead. She retired to her chambers early, her thoughts consumed by Gregory's request. As she lay awake, the key pressed against her palm, she could not shake the feeling that her choices were hurtling her toward a precipice. In the study, Philip sat in silence, his fingers steepled as he considered his next move. He now knew Eleanor's intentions, and the pieces of his plan were falling into place. The game was nearing its end, and soon the truth would come to light, no matter how painful the revelation might be. The night passed slowly for Eleanor, her thoughts circling Gregory's request. The small key he had given her felt like a weight pressing against her chest, a physical reminder of the decision she was on the verge of making. Could she really go through with it? Could she betray Philip, the man who had provided her with stability, for the uncertain promises of a man like Gregory? She rose early, her restlessness driving her to action. She avoided Philip at breakfast, feigning a headache, and retreated to the solitude of her chambers. There, she took out the key and examined it, running her fingers over its cold surface. Gregory's words echoed in her mind: freedom, independence, a new life. But at what cost? Unbeknownst to Eleanor, Philip had been awake long before dawn. He had spent the night carefully considering his next move. Thomas had returned late in the evening with a full report of Eleanor's latest meeting with Gregory, including the key and a request Gregory had made of her. Philip's suspicion had grown into certainty, and now he knew the time had come to act. Mid-morning, Eleanor decided to leave the manor once more. She told and she planned to visit the village, but this time her purpose was clear. The key burned in her pocket, its weight a constant reminder of the decision she was about to make. She avoided Philip, her guilt mounting with every step she took. As she climbed into the carriage, Philip watched her from the library window. His expression was grim, his jaw set. He had instructed Thomas to follow her yet again, but this time he had additional plans in motion. The time for silent observation was over. Eleanor arrived in the village, her nerves fraying as she approached Gregory's office. It was a modest building tucked away on a quiet street, its unassuming appearance belying the power Gregory held in his dealings. She glanced around nervously before entering, her heart racing. Inside, she found the safe Gregory had described. It was small and unmarked, tucked behind a simple wooden desk. Her hands trembled as she inserted the key, the lock clicking open with ease. Inside, she found a stack of papers, deeds, financial documents, and a letter bearing her name. She took them, all, her heart pounding in her chest. As she turned to leave, the sound of footsteps outside the door made her freeze. She quickly closed the safe and slipped the papers into her gown, her breath catching as the door swung open. To her relief, it was only the office clerk, a young man who barely glanced at her as he entered to retrieve a ledger. Eleanor hurried out, the weight of the stolen papers pressing against her. The realization of what she had done hit her like a cold wind. She had crossed the line. There was no turning back now. But she wasn't alone. Thomas had followed her from the moment she left the manor, watching her every move from the shadows. He saw her enter Gregory's office, saw her leave with something concealed beneath her gown. His heart sank as he realized just how far Eleanor was willing to go. He wasted no time returning to Warrington Manor to deliver the final piece of evidence to Philip. By the time Eleanor returned home, she was a bundle of nerves. She avoided Philip once again, retreating to her chambers where she laid out the stolen documents. As she read through them, Gregory's plan became clear. The papers detailed not only the property he had promised her, but also a series of financial transactions that would secure her independence. It was all so close: freedom, security, a life of her own making. She carefully folded the papers and hid them, her mind spinning. Tomorrow, she would deliver them to Gregory. And then, what? She couldn't think that far ahead. All she knew was that she had to see this through. Philip, meanwhile, sat in his study, the evidence laid out before him. Thomas had spared no detail in his report, and the documents Eleanor had taken were now known to him as well. He stared at them in silence, the weight of her betrayal sinking in fully. The time for patience was over. That evening, as the household settled into its usual routine, Philip summoned Eleanor to the drawing room. She entered hesitantly, surprised to find him standing by the fire, his expression unreadable. "You called for me?" she asked, her voice betraying her unease. Philip turned to face her, his gaze piercing. "Yes, Eleanor. I believe it is time we spoke frankly." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. "About what?" Philip gestured to the seat across from him. "Sit." She obeyed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The flickering firelight cast shadows across his face, making him seem both familiar and strange. "I've been observing you, Eleanor," Philip began, his tone calm but firm, "and I know what you've been doing." Her blood ran cold. "I don't know what you mean." Philip stepped closer, his eyes locked on hers. "Do not insult me with lies. I know about Gregory Standish. I know about the jewels, the papers, the promises he's made to you." Eleanor's breath caught, her mind racing for a way out. "Philip, he held up a hand, silencing her. "Enough! You've made your choices, Eleanor, and now it is time for you to face the consequences." Eleanor froze, her mind reeling. The calm precision of Philip's words was more terrifying than any outburst. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. How had he known? How much did he know? The room seemed to close in around her, the fire crackling softly in the silence that stretched between them. Philip watched her carefully, his expression unreadable. "You have nothing to say for yourself?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with disappointment. She forced herself to meet his gaze, her voice trembling. "Philip, whatever you think, it's not what it seems." Philip's jaw tightened. "It's exactly what it seems, Eleanor. Do not attempt to twist the truth. I know about the meetings in the woods, the jewels Gregory gave you, the papers you stole from his office. Every move you've made has been observed." Eleanor's face drained of color. "You've been spying on me," she whispered, a mixture of outrage and fear in her voice. "Call it what you will," Philip replied, stepping closer. "But your actions left me no choice. I had to know the truth, and now I do." She rose to her feet, her hands trembling. "You don't understand, Philip." I understand perfectly," he interrupted, his voice cutting through her protest. "You were willing to betray me, to abandon this life, for the promises of a man who feeds on greed and ambition. Did you think I wouldn't notice? Did you think I was so blind, so trusting?" Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "You don't know what it's been like for me," she said, her voice cracking. "To live in this house, to feel invisible, trapped. Gregory, he offered me something different, something I thought I deserved." Philip's expression softened for a moment, but his resolve remained firm. "And you thought the answer was betrayal? You thought abandoning everything we built together was the way to escape your unhappiness?" Eleanor looked away, unable to hold his gaze. "You don't know what it feels like to be suffocated by your own life." "No," Philip said quietly, "but I know what it feels like to trust someone completely and have that trust shattered." The room fell silent again, the only sound the steady crackle of the fire. Philip turned away, his shoulders heavy with the weight of the confrontation. "You will not deliver those papers to Gregory," he said finally. "You will not leave this house without my permission. From this moment forward, you are to be watched at all times." Eleanor's eyes widened. "You can't do this." "I can and I will," Philip said, his tone brooking no argument. "This is my house, and you have proven yourself unworthy of the freedom I once gave you." She clenched her fists, anger replacing her fear. "So that's it? You're going to punish me like a child? Hold me prisoner in this manner?" "No, Eleanor," Philip said, turning back to her. "I'm giving you a chance to reflect, to think about the choices you've made and the harm they've caused. Consider it mercy, for Gregory would not be so kind if he knew I had the power to destroy him." Eleanor's breath caught. "What are you talking about?" Philip's gaze hardened. "Do you truly think Gregory cares for you? That his promises were genuine? He wanted to use you, Eleanor, to gain leverage over me and this estate. You were nothing more than a pawn in his game." Eleanor felt as though the ground had been ripped out from beneath her. "You're lying," she whispered. "Am I?" Philip asked, his voice cold. "The documents you stole detail more than just a property. They include forged deeds and fraudulent accounts meant to siphon wealth from this estate into his hands. Gregory Standish is a con man, Eleanor, and you fell for his lies." The truth hit her like a blow, and she staggered slightly, gripping the back of a chair for support. Philip's words rang with an authority she couldn't deny, and in her heart, she knew he was right. She had been foolish, blinded by promises of a better life. What? What happens now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Philip's expression remained hard, but there was a flicker of sadness in his eyes. "That depends on you, Eleanor. If you show true remorse, if you can prove that you are willing to change, there may still be a chance for redemption. But if you continue to deceive me, to justify your betrayal, then you will leave this house with nothing." Eleanor sank into the chair, her mind spinning. The gravity of her actions, the consequences she now faced, pressed down on her like a physical weight. She had gambled everything, and she had lost. Philip stepped toward the door, his voice soft but firm. "You have a choice to make, Eleanor. Think carefully, for there will be no second chances." As he left the room, the door closing softly behind him, Eleanor sat in silence, her tears finally falling. For the first time, she realized just how much she had sacrificed in pursuit of her selfish desires, and just how far she had fallen from the woman she once was. Philip, retreating to his study, poured himself a glass of brandy and stared into the fire. His heart was heavy, but his resolve was unshaken. He had given Eleanor a chance to prove herself, but the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. Whether their marriage could survive her betrayal remained uncertain, but for now he would wait and see if she could rise from the ruins of her choices. And if she could not, he knew he would have to let her go, no matter how much it pained him. Eleanor sat in the quiet of the drawing room long after Philip had left, her mind awash with shame, anger, and regret. The truth of Gregory's intentions, revealed so plainly by Philip, had shattered the fragile fantasy she had built around the merchant's promises. She had allowed herself to be seduced not just by Gregory's charm, but by the idea of escape, an idea that now seemed as hollow as her own excuses. Her tears fell freely, the weight of her choices pressing down on her. She thought of her life at Warrington Manor, of the security and status she had once cherished. She had seen herself as a victim of circumstance, but now, for the first time, she understood the depth of her selfishness. Philip had given her everything, and she had repaid him with betrayal. The following morning, Eleanor awoke with a pounding headache and the lingering heaviness of the previous night's confrontation, and entered her room quietly, setting down a tray with tea and toast. "My lady," and said softly, her eyes filled with concern, "are you unwell?" Eleanor forced a faint smile. "I'm fine and just tired," and hesitated, clearly wanting to say more, but she finally nodded and left the room. Eleanor sat up, sipping her tea as her thoughts turned to Philip. She owed him an apology, though she doubted words alone could ever repair the damage she had done. Yet she resolved to try. Later that morning she found Philip in the study, poring over estate ledgers. He looked up as she entered, his expression guarded. Eleanor's courage faltered under the weight of his gaze, but she forced herself to speak. "Philip," she began, her voice trembling, I've come to apologize for everything." He set down his pen and leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Go on," he said, his tone neutral. She clasped her hands tightly, her words spilling out in a rush. "I was wrong to doubt you, wrong to let Gregory manipulate me. I let my own fears and insecurities cloud my judgment, and I betrayed your trust. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know that I see now how foolish I've been." Philip remained silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally he spoke. "Do you truly understand, Eleanor? This isn't just about Gregory or the jewels. It's about the choices you made, the decision to turn away from me, from us." "I do understand," she said, her voice breaking. "I let my own selfishness blind me to what really matters. I see that now." Philip's gaze softened slightly, though his tone remained firm. Words are a start, Eleanor, but they're not enough. If you want to rebuild what we've lost, it will take more than an apology. It will take time, effort, and honesty. Eleanor nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. I'll do whatever it takes. Philip rose from his chair and walked to the window, looking out at the estate. I'm not sure if we can ever go back to what we were, he said quietly, but I'm willing to give you a chance to prove yourself. Eleanor felt a glimmer of hope, though it was tempered by the knowledge of how far she had fallen. Thank you, she whispered. Philip turned to face her, his expression serious. Understand this, Eleanor. There are no more second chances. If you falter again, there will be no place for you here. She nodded, her resolve hardening. I won't falter. I promise. The days that followed were tense, but marked by small steps toward reconciliation. Eleanor threw herself into the work of the estate, assisting Philip with tenant matters and learning the intricacies of the finances. She worked tirelessly, determined to prove that she could be trusted again. The servants noticed the change in her demeanor, though whispers of her earlier indiscretions lingered in the air. Philip, for his part, watched her closely. He saw her efforts, her determination, but he also saw the guilt that haunted her. He wanted to believe she could change, but the wound of her betrayal ran deep. Trust, once broken, was not easily repaired. One afternoon, as they walked through the gardens together, Eleanor spoke hesitantly. Do you ever think we can truly move past this? Philip glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. I don't know, he admitted, but I'm willing to try if you are. Eleanor nodded, her chest tightening with both hope and fear. I am. I want to make this right. Philip reached out and took her hand, his touch hesitant but genuine. Then we'll take it one day at a time. Eleanor felt a surge of gratitude, though she knew the road ahead would not be easy. She had made mistakes, grave ones, but she was determined to rebuild what she had nearly destroyed. For the first time in months, she felt a flicker of hope that, perhaps, redemption was possible. But as the sun set over Warrington Manor that evening, Philip sat alone in his study, staring into the fire. He wanted to believe in Eleanor's sincerity, but a part of him remained wary. The scars of betrayal, though hidden, still lingered. Only time would tell if their marriage could withstand the weight of all that had passed, or if the cracks would deepen, leading to an inevitable collapse. The weeks that followed were marked by quiet efforts and unspoken tension. Eleanor devoted herself fully to her role as the lady of the manor, determined to prove to Philip that she could be the wife he deserved. She attended to the tenants with renewed diligence, overseeing the distribution of provisions and resolving disputes with a patience she had never shown before. The servants whispered of the change in her demeanor, some believing it genuine, others skeptical of her sudden transformation. Philip, though outwardly supportive, remained guarded. He acknowledged her efforts with polite but distant gratitude, never offering the warmth that had once defined their marriage. His trust, he knew, could not be so easily restored. Every action she took, every word she spoke, was carefully measured against the weight of her betrayal. He found himself questioning her motives, wondering if her remorse was born of genuine regret or fear of losing the life she had grown accustomed to. One evening, as the first signs of spring began to appear in the gardens, Philip and Eleanor sat in the drawing room. The fire burned low, casting flickering shadows across the room. Eleanor, seated in a high-backed chair, worked on an embroidery project, her hands deftly stitching a pattern of wildflowers. Philip watched her from across the room, his gaze thoughtful. You've been working hard, he said at last, breaking the silence. Eleanor glanced up, her expression uncertain. I want to make things right. Philip nodded slowly. I've seen that, but, Eleanor, I need to know. Why now? Why this change? She set down her embroidery, her hands trembling slightly. Because I was blind, Philip. I let my fears, my pride, and my foolish desires cloud my judgment. I thought I wanted something more, but I didn't see what I already had. It wasn't until I nearly lost it that I realized how much it meant to me. Philip studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Do you truly believe that? Or are you simply afraid of losing your place here? Her breath caught, and she looked away, guilt flashing across her face. "I won't lie to you," she said softly. "There was a time when I thought only of myself, of what I stood to lose. But now, I see that it's not the estate or the comforts I care about. It's you, Philip. I hurt you, and I can never undo that. But I want to try to be the woman you thought I was, the woman you deserve." For a moment, Philip said nothing. The flickering light of the fire danced in his eyes, masking the turmoil within. Finally, he rose and crossed the room, standing before her. He reached out, taking her hands in his. They were cold, trembling, and he held them firmly. "Actions speak louder than words, Eleanor," he said, his voice steady. "You've taken steps in the right direction, but trust is not something that can be rebuilt overnight. It will take time, effort, and honesty." "I understand," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. Philip released her hands and stepped back, his expression softening slightly. "Then let us continue as we are. We'll see where this path leads." Eleanor nodded, her chest tightening with a mixture of relief and determination. She knew the road ahead would be long, but for the first time, she felt that she had a chance to make things right. As the days turned into weeks, life at Warrington Manor began to settle into a tentative peace. Philip and Eleanor worked side by side, their interactions marked by cautious civility. The estate flourished under their combined efforts, and the tenants began to speak of their lord and lady with renewed respect. But beneath the surface, the scars of betrayal lingered, unspoken but ever-present. One afternoon, as Philip inspected the stables, he was approached by Thomas. The valet, ever loyal, hesitated before speaking. "My lord," he began, "I thought it best to inform you. Gregory Standish has returned to the village." Philip's expression darkened. "What business does he have here?" "I do not know," Thomas admitted, "but I thought you should be aware." Philip nodded, his jaw tightening. "Thank you, Thomas. Keep an eye on him, but do nothing for now." As Thomas departed, Philip felt a surge of unease. Gregory's return was an unwelcome reminder of the past, a shadow that threatened to disrupt the fragile peace he and Eleanor had worked to rebuild. He resolved to confront the merchant if necessary, determined to protect what remained of his marriage. Later that evening, Philip shared the news with Eleanor. Her reaction was immediate, her face paled, and her hands clenched the edge of the table. "Gregory," she whispered. "Here." "Yes," Philip said, his tone measured. "I've had Thomas watching him. If he tries to approach you or anyone connected to this estate, I will deal with him." Eleanor nodded, her voice barely audible. "I understand." But as she lay awake that night, the specter of Gregory's return haunted her thoughts. She had betrayed Philip once, and now, with Gregory so close, she feared her past mistakes would come back to destroy everything she had worked to rebuild. Philip, too, lay awake, staring at the ceiling as his mind raced. He had begun to see glimpses of the woman he had once loved in Eleanor's recent actions, but Gregory's presence threatened to unravel it all. He resolved to confront the man directly, to ensure that the past would not intrude on the future he and Eleanor were struggling to forge. The storm of their betrayal had not yet passed, and as the shadows lengthened over Warrington Manor, both Philip and Eleanor braced themselves for what lay ahead. The morning after Thomas's report, Philip made his decision. He would confront Gregory Standish directly, ensuring the man understood that his schemes were no longer welcome. Gregory's presence in the village was a dangerous thread dangling over the fragile peace of Warrington Manor, and Philip intended to sever it. He rose early, his demeanor calm but resolute, and instructed Thomas to ready his horse. Before leaving, he sought out Eleanor, who was seated in the garden, a book resting unread in her lap. Her pale face and distracted air told him she was already aware of his intentions. "You're going to see him, aren't you?" she asked, her voice soft. Philip nodded. "Yes. I will not allow him to linger here, not after everything he's done." Eleanor hesitated, her hands clutching the edges of the book. "Please, Philip, don't let him provoke you. He's a manipulator. He'll twist the truth to serve his own ends." "I am well aware of who Gregory Standish is," Philip replied, his tone steady. "But rest assured, I am not so easily swayed. This conversation is for his benefit as much as ours." Eleanor nodded, though her worry was evident. Be careful. Philip didn't reply, simply inclining his head before turning and striding toward the stables. Minutes later, he was riding toward the village, the early morning air crisp and cool against his face. When he arrived, it didn't take long to locate Gregory. The merchant was holding court in the tavern, his easy charm drawing a small group of villagers into laughter. Philip dismounted, his boots crunching against the gravel as he approached the building. Inside, the jovial atmosphere dimmed as the towering figure of Lord Warrington entered. Gregory looked up, his expression momentarily faltering before he regained his composure. "Lord Warrington," Gregory said, rising from his seat with a feigned air of respect. "To what do I owe the honor?" Philip crossed the room, his presence commanding. "We need to speak. Now." Gregory raised an eyebrow, glancing around at his audience before nodding. "Of course, my lord. Shall we step outside?" The two men exited the tavern, the crowd's murmurs fading as they moved into the open air. Philip's sharp gaze pinned Gregory in place as they stood beneath the shadow of the tavern's eaves. "You've returned to the village," Philip began, his voice calm but laced with steel. "Why?" Gregory smirked, leaning casually against the wall. "Surely a man is free to travel where he pleases. Or have you taken ownership of the village as well as the manor?" "Don't play games with me," Philip said, his tone dropping. "You came here to stir trouble, and I won't allow it. You've already done enough damage." Gregory's smirk faded slightly, though his eyes gleamed with defiance. "If you're referring to Lady Eleanor, I believe that matter is between her and me." Philip's fist clenched at his side, but he forced himself to remain composed. "Lady Eleanor is my wife. Whatever misguided notions you planted in her mind are over. You will leave this village immediately, and you will not return." Gregory straightened, his casual demeanor giving way to irritation. "And if I don't?" Philip stepped closer, his voice dangerously low. "Then I will ensure that every business dealing, every lie, and every scheme of yours is exposed. You'll find no allies here, nor anywhere else. Do not test me, Standish. I've tolerated enough." For a moment, Gregory seemed to weigh his options, his eyes narrowing as he studied Philip's unyielding expression. Finally, he laughed softly, shaking his head. "You're a formidable man, Lord Warrington. I'll give you that. Very well, I'll leave. But let me leave you with this thought. Not all chains are made of iron. Sometimes they're of your own making." With that, Gregory turned and walked away, his retreat more a calculated maneuver than a surrender. Philip watched him go, his jaw tight. He knew Gregory's words were meant to linger, to plant seeds of doubt, but he refused to let them take root. Returning to Warrington Manor, Philip felt a mix of relief and lingering unease. He had confronted Gregory and secured his departure, but the man's parting words echoed in his mind. Did he truly believe Eleanor had changed, or was he holding on to hope out of necessity? When he arrived home, Eleanor was waiting in the drawing room. She rose quickly, her expression anxious. Did he agree to leave? "Yes," Philip said, his tone measured. "He's gone for now. But men like him rarely disappear forever." Eleanor's shoulders sagged with relief, though guilt still lingered in her eyes. "Thank you, Philip. I know I don't deserve your protection, but I'm grateful." Philip regarded her silently for a moment before speaking. "I didn't do this for you alone. I did it for the estate, for the life we've built here. But Eleanor, Gregory's presence was not the only threat. The true danger lies in how we respond to what's already happened." She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I understand." Philip stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "Then prove it. Show me that you're worthy of the trust we're trying to rebuild. Because if Gregory's shadow falls over this house again, I won't hesitate to sever all ties." Eleanor swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking in. "I won't let you down." As Philip left the room, she sank into a chair, her hands trembling. She had been given another chance, but she knew the margin for error was gone. Every decision she made from this moment forward would determine whether she could truly rebuild the life she had nearly destroyed, or whether the ghosts of her betrayal would haunt her forever. The days that followed were marked by cautious progress. Eleanor threw herself into her duties with renewed vigor, her determination to regain Philip's trust unwavering. Philip, though still guarded, began to soften slightly, acknowledging her efforts with small gestures of kindness. Slowly, the cracks in their marriage began to heal, though the scars remained. But deep in his heart, Philip knew that trust, once broken, could never be fully restored. And while he hoped for a future where he and Eleanor could move forward together, he also knew that the shadow of betrayal would never truly leave Warrington Manor. Months passed, and Warrington Manor gradually returned to a semblance of normalcy. Eleanor remained devoted to her tasks, her transformation evident to all who observed her. She spent hours overseeing the estate, visiting tenants, and personally ensuring that the household ran smoothly. The servants, once skeptical of her change, began to whisper in favor of her dedication. Yet beneath her composed exterior, Eleanor remained acutely aware of the fragile ground on which she stood. Philip, too, adapted to their new reality. Though his interactions with Eleanor were polite and cordial, there was a guardedness to his demeanor that had not existed before. He acknowledged her efforts, but refrained from expressing the affection that had once been the cornerstone of their marriage. For him, rebuilding trust was a cautious, deliberate process, and he was determined not to allow his emotions to cloud his judgment again. One crisp autumn morning, Eleanor prepared to accompany Philip on a visit to the estate's farthest tenant farms. It was the first time in months that he had invited her to join him, a gesture she interpreted as a tentative sign of reconciliation. She dressed simply, her usual finery replaced with practical riding attire, and met him in the courtyard where the horses were being saddled. "You're punctual," Philip remarked as she approached, his tone neutral but not unkind. Eleanor smiled faintly. "I thought it best not to keep you waiting." He nodded and helped her mount her horse before climbing onto his own. The ride through the estate was peaceful, the autumn leaves rustling in the breeze as they made their way down the winding paths. They spoke little, but the silence was not as strained as it had once been. Eleanor took it as a small victory, though she remained cautious, careful not to misstep. When they arrived at the tenant farms, Philip dismounted and greeted the farmer, an elderly man named Mr. Burrows. Eleanor followed, offering a warm smile as she handed over a basket of provisions she had prepared earlier. "Lady Warrington," Mr. Burrows said with a respectful bow, "it's a rare pleasure to see you here." "It's long overdue," Eleanor replied. "I hope the harvest has been kind this year." "It has, thanks to Lord Warrington's guidance," Mr. Burrows said, casting an admiring glance at Philip. "And, of course, your generosity." Philip observed the exchange in silence, noting the ease with which Eleanor spoke to the tenants. She had once shown little interest in such matters, but now she seemed genuinely invested. It was a small but significant change, one he could not ignore. As they rode back to the manor later that afternoon, Eleanor finally spoke. "Thank you for allowing me to join you today." Philip glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "You handled yourself well." She smiled, a flicker of hope igniting in her chest. "I'm trying, Philip. I know it doesn't erase the past, but I want to be better. For you, for the estate, for myself." Philip did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked out at the golden fields stretching toward the horizon. "Actions speak louder than words," he said at last, "and I've seen your actions, Eleanor. Their start." His words, though measured, carried a warmth she hadn't heard in months. It wasn't a full restoration of their bond, but it was a step forward. Eleanor clung to it, determined to keep moving in the right direction. The following weeks brought further progress. Philip began inviting Eleanor to join him in estate meetings and allowed her to take a more active role in decision-making. She embraced the responsibility, throwing herself into her work with unwavering dedication. Slowly, the walls between them began to crumble, though neither dared to acknowledge it openly. But even as they worked toward rebuilding their relationship, the shadow of Gregory Standish lingered. Though he had left the village months ago, rumors of his schemes reached Philip's ears from time to time. The man's reputation for deception and manipulation had not diminished, and Philip remained vigilant, wary of any sign that Gregory might return. One evening, as Philip sat in his study reviewing estate documents, Thomas entered, his expression grave. "My lord," he said, "a letter has arrived. It bears Gregory Standish's seal." Philip's jaw tightened, and he held out his hand. Thomas placed the letter in his grasp before retreating from the room. Philip broke the seal and unfolded the parchment, his eyes scanning the elegant script. Lord Warrington, though our paths have diverged, I find it prudent to remind you that certain truths, when buried, have a way of resurfacing. Take care, my lord, that your house remains in order. Yours, Gregory Standish. Philip's fist clenched, the letter crumpling slightly in his grasp. The veiled threat was clear, and though Gregory had no immediate foothold in Warrington Manor, his ability to sow discord remained dangerous. Philip placed the letter in a drawer, locking it away as his mind raced. He resolved not to share the letter with Eleanor, not yet. Their progress was fragile, and he refused to allow Gregory's interference to derail it. But he knew that the battle for their future was far from over. Gregory's shadow loomed over them still, and Philip would need to be prepared for whatever came next. For now, though, he focused on the small victories, the cautious smiles, the shared moments, the glimmers of hope that their marriage might one day be whole again. It would be a long road, but Philip was determined to walk it, one careful step at a time. The arrival of Gregory Standish's letter weighed heavily on Philip's mind. Though he hid his concern well, over the following weeks, life at Warrington Manor continued in its steady rhythm, and Eleanor's dedication to her newfound role remained unwavering. She managed the household with a quiet competence that impressed even the most skeptical of servants, and her efforts to rebuild trust with Philip were slowly bearing fruit. Yet Gregory's cryptic warning lingered in the back of Philip's mind, an unwelcome reminder that the peace they had worked so hard to restore was still vulnerable. He kept the letter locked away, telling himself that sharing it with Eleanor would only stir unnecessary anxiety. Instead, he resolved to keep watch, ensuring that Gregory could not interfere again. One crisp evening, Philip and Eleanor found themselves alone in the drawing room. The servants had retired for the night, and the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the soft ticking of the grandfather clock. Eleanor sat by the hearth, embroidering a cushion, while Philip read from a leather-bound volume of estate law. The silence was companionable, a sign of how far they had come since Gregory's departure. Yet Eleanor could not help but notice the tension in Philip's posture, the slight furrow in his brow as he read. "Philip," she said gently, setting her embroidery aside, "is something troubling you?" He glanced up, his expression briefly softening before the guardedness returned. "Nothing of consequence." Eleanor frowned, leaning forward slightly. "You've been distracted lately. If there's something I can help with, it's estate business," he interrupted, though his tone was not unkind. "Matters I'm handling." She hesitated, unsure whether to press further. In the past, she might have left it alone, but now she felt a responsibility to show him that she was not the same woman who had once turned away from his struggles. "Philip," she said, her voice firm but quiet, "I know I've given you every reason to doubt me, but I want to share your burdens, not add to them. Please, if there's something weighing on you, let me help." He regarded her for a long moment, his gaze searching. Finally, he sighed and set down his book. "A letter arrived some weeks ago," he admitted. "From Gregory Standish." Eleanor's breath caught, her pulse quickening. What did he want? Philip's jaw tightened. It wasn't a request so much as a threat. Reminder that he knows things about us, about you, and that he's willing to use that knowledge to his advantage. Eleanor paled, her hands trembling. "Philip, I swear, I've had no contact with him. I thought he was gone for good." "I believe you," Philip said, his voice steady. "But Gregory thrives on manipulation. He doesn't need direct contact to cause harm. He plants seeds of doubt and lets them grow." Eleanor's guilt resurfaced, sharp and unforgiving. "I brought this on us," she whispered. If I hadn't trusted him, he wouldn't have this power over us." Philip leaned forward, his expression softening. "You made mistakes, Eleanor. We both have, but Gregory's actions are his own. Do not let him make you believe otherwise." She nodded, though tears shimmered in her eyes. "What should we do?" "We wait," Philip said. "For now, there's no evidence that he intends to act. But if he does, we'll face it together." Eleanor's heart swelled at his words. Though his trust in her was still fragile, his willingness to stand by her gave her hope that their marriage might one day be whole again. In the days that followed, Eleanor threw herself even more fervently into her work. She visited tenants, assisted with estate matters, and even began corresponding with other ladies of the gentry to forge alliances that might benefit the Warrington name. Her efforts did not go unnoticed, and Philip began to see glimpses of the woman he had once fallen in love with. But Gregory's shadow loomed ever larger. One evening, Thomas approached Philip with news that unsettled him deeply. "My lord," Thomas said, his voice low, "there have been sightings of Gregory Standish near the outskirts of the village. He's not been seen speaking to anyone yet, but his presence has not gone unnoticed." Philip's expression darkened. "He's testing the waters," he muttered, looking for a way back in. Thomas hesitated before continuing. "There's more, my lord. A tenant mentioned seeing him in the company of a young servant, a stable boy from a neighboring estate. He may be attempting to gain information about the manor." Philip's fist clenched at his side. "If he's trying to worm his way back into our lives, he'll regret it." That evening, Philip shared the news with Eleanor. Her reaction was immediate, a mixture of fear and determination. "We can't let him destroy everything we've worked for," she said. "We need to act." Philip nodded, his expression grim. "We will. I won't let him interfere again." Together, they devised a plan to counter Gregory's influence. Philip would meet with local magistrates to ensure Gregory's activities were closely monitored, while Eleanor would use her growing network of allies to spread word of his deceitful nature. They would not confront him directly, not yet, but they would ensure that his ability to manipulate and threaten was severely limited. As they worked together, a new sense of partnership began to emerge between them. For the first time in months, Philip felt a glimmer of hope that their marriage might not only survive, but grow stronger in the face of adversity. Eleanor, too, felt a renewed sense of purpose, determined to prove that she was no longer the woman who had once been so easily swayed by empty promises. But Gregory was not a man to be underestimated, and as Warrington Manor prepared to defend itself against his looming presence, both Philip and Eleanor knew that the final confrontation was drawing near, a confrontation that would test the strength of their bond and the depth of their resolve. The days following Thomas's report were filled with quiet preparation. Philip met with the local magistrates, ensuring that Gregory's movements were carefully tracked. Eleanor, meanwhile, used her growing social network to warn the neighboring estates of Gregory's reputation. Whispers of his deceit began to spread, eroding any credibility he might have had. Still, the knowledge of Gregory's proximity unsettled them both. Eleanor often found herself looking over her shoulder, her nerves on edge. Philip, though outwardly calm, carried a tension that even the servants noticed. The shadow of Gregory Standish loomed over Warrington Manor, threatening to undo everything they had worked to rebuild. One evening, as Philip reviewed estate accounts in the study, Thomas entered with urgent news. "My lord, Gregory Standish was seen near the manor grounds earlier today. He spoke with one of the stable boys." Philip rose from his chair, his jaw tightening. What did he want? The boy claimed Standish asked about the layout of the grounds and the routines of the household. Thomas replied, "It seems he's planning something." Philip's eyes narrowed. "Then we must be ready. Increase security around the estate. No one enters or leaves without my permission." Thomas nodded and left to carry out the orders. Philip turned to the fire, his thoughts dark. Gregory was becoming bolder, and Philip knew it was only a matter of time before the man made his move. That night, Philip shared the news with Eleanor. Her face paled, but her resolve remained steady. "What can we do?" she asked. "We'll be prepared," Philip replied. "But Eleanor, if Gregory tries to contact you directly, you must tell me immediately. No more secrets." She nodded, her voice firm. "I promise." The storm came 2 nights later. A fierce wind howled through the manor grounds, rattling the windows and casting eerie shadows in the dim light of the lanterns. The servants moved through the halls nervously, their unease mirroring the tempest outside. Philip had stationed guards around the manor, but the tension in the air was palpable. He and Eleanor sat in the drawing room, their conversation subdued as they awaited any news. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she held her tea, but she forced herself to remain composed. It was near midnight when Thomas burst into the room, his expression grave. "My lord," Standish has been spotted near the east gate. He's not alone, there are 2 others with him. Philip rose immediately. Secure the gate. Ensure they don't get inside. Yes, my lord, Thomas said, hurrying away. Eleanor stood, her eyes wide. Philip, please be careful. He turned to her, his expression softening. I will. Stay here. I'll handle this. As Philip and the guards moved to confront Gregory, Eleanor paced the drawing room, her heart pounding. She felt helpless, her mind racing with fears of what might happen. The minutes dragged on like hours until finally, Thomas returned, his face flushed from the cold. It's done, he said. Standish and his men have been turned away. They won't trouble us again. Eleanor sagged with relief, but Thomas's expression remained serious. My lord wants to speak with you in the study. She followed him, her heart heavy with anticipation. When she entered the study, she found Philip standing by the fire, his expression grim but victorious. It's over, he said simply. Gregory won't come back. How can you be sure? Eleanor asked, her voice trembling. Philip turned to face her fully. Because he knows now that he has no power here. The magistrates will ensure he's watched closely, and the neighboring estates are united against him. He's finished. Eleanor nodded, tears of relief filling her eyes. Thank you, Philip. His expression softened as he stepped closer. You've done your part, Eleanor. Your efforts didn't go unnoticed. Together, we've protected this estate and each other. She reached for his hand, her voice breaking. I'm sorry for everything. I know I can never undo the hurt I caused, but I hope I've shown you that I can be better. Philip held her gaze for a long moment before squeezing her hand gently. You've shown me more than I expected. Let's leave the past where it belongs and look forward. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having passed both outside and within Warrington Manor. The estate seemed renewed, the air crisp with the promise of a new beginning. Philip and Eleanor walked through the gardens together, their steps unhurried. The tension that had hung between them for so long was finally beginning to lift, replaced by a tentative but growing sense of unity. As they reached the edge of the estate, Philip paused, looking out over the golden fields. This land, this life, it's worth fighting for, he said quietly. And so are you. Eleanor looked at him, her heart swelling with gratitude. And I'll keep proving that I'm worthy of it. Philip turned to her, a faint smile touching his lips. You already have. They continued their walk, the sunlight casting long shadows that stretched behind them, reminders of a past that had tested them to their limits. But as they moved forward side by side, it was clear that the future belonged to them, to the Warringtons and the legacy they had fought to protect. And so, amidst the renewed life of the estate, Warrington Manor stood as a testament not only to resilience, but to the power of redemption, forgiveness, and the bonds of love that, though tested, had endured. We've come to the end of the story. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to my channel and share to loved ones. Thank you very much.